please welcome to the stage our panel host, Chris Dartnell, Senior Vice President of Power Systems, Schneider Electric.
Radical collaboration. Radical meaning going to the origin, the fundamental essence of change. And collaboration, of course, being a cooperative approach. This morning, we're going to explore the changing roles in the value chain in the Australia and Pacific energy systems as we make the transformation and change our behaviors whilst trying to solve the energy trilemma, not a dilemma, but a trilemma of secure, affordable, and sustainable energy for everyone. We're going to discuss the changes in supply as coal phases to renewables, in demand as the massive change of distributed energy resources and EV comes into play, and the orchestrating role of the grids in the middle here. And maybe wider than technology is the need for new alignments and partnerships, new behaviors as the ever more interconnected system comes into play, and demand and supply have to cooperate together. So joining me today, we have 4 special guests to share their expertise and discuss with you and inform. We have Chow Lee, the GM of e-mobility for Origin Energy, come up and join us. We have Lisa Zembrot, the principal of the sustainability energy business in Schneider Electric. Byron Ross, the Chief Operating Officer of Graphite Energy, and Gianfranco Monzini, the VP of our global process electrification business in Schneider. Please come and join me. Welcome, welcome.
Chris. Good morning, Chris.
Thanks, Chris. Thank you. Welcome, folks. A beautiful audience for your entertainment in the coming 40 minutes or so. I want to try and explore this radical collaboration theme that we're underpinning the discussions here. But let's start first with the supply side of the energy transition. And maybe, Lisa, how do you see the changing investments in supply side? What's changing in Australia in the way you go about investment there?
Thanks, Chris. Probably the biggest change is the fact that we are retiring all of our coal assets. So by 2038, all of the coal assets in Australia will have been retired. So we are replacing all of the coal assets with renewables and storage in particular. And if you think about what that means, we're essentially flipping the grid on its head, right? So we used to just be able to run a production line or run the kettle and not really think at all about what that means from a supply side, right? The supply would ramp up to meet that demand. But as we replace that with renewables and storage, we need to think a bit more about how can we ensure that the two, demand and supply, are playing together, right? Because as we move to renewables and storage, might not always be available unless we have enough storage, which is of course the aim. So that's really the key change. And what that means then is that we need 3 things for this to work. We need incentives, right? So those with flexible loads need to be incentivized to provide flexibility to the grid. We need flexible loads, right? So all the investments that businesses are making today need to be geared towards improving that flexibility of demand. And the other thing that we would need is orchestration. So we need a grid that's capable of enabling that collaboration between the supply and demand side.
Tell me about those in order then. I mean, the incentives are there or still more to do?
There's still more to do. In particular, large energy users need to understand the incentives that exist. We need more incentives put into the system, particularly through the markets and through the supply contracts. But big users need to understand that if they provide flexibility to the grid, they will be compensated for that. That is what will drive more flexibility and flexible assets on the demand side into the grid.
And this role of orchestration, it seems, when we were speaking earlier today, that change from generation just being there to to support everything. Now, demand and generation need to be much more aligned. I guess that's the orchestrating role of the grids, or it's the role of digital, or it's the role of partnership, or all of those?
All of those. So I think this is a multifaceted solution. And it was found that $6 billion would be saved if we can enable flexible assets and orchestration in the grid. And that's a massive amount of money when we think about the other investments that need to be made. So I think AMO's estimate is that the transition of the grid will cost some $122 billion if memory serves. And that's a lot of money. It's far cheaper than climate change, mind you, but still a massive investment that needs to go into the grid. So we need all of these solutions.
Tell us about that $6 billion. That's cost avoidance of optimization, is it?
It is. So it's very much about making sure that we don't build too much, making sure that we're not wasting energy. You heard Colette talk about that yesterday. So it's very much about ensuring that we're optimizing the assets and optimizing the investments without needing to overinvest in the system. So if we can ramp down demand a bit when required, that means that we don't need to overbuild the supply to meet those extra peak demands.
So maybe that's the first element of collaboration that we've talked about in this morning, because to avoid that $6 billion, you've got to be able to collaborate on when the energy is needed and what energy is available after the meter to be able to support us, I guess.
Absolutely, and that digitization, as you mentioned, is critical to sending the right signals at the right times.
Very good. And do you see a role for AI here in digitization? Or?
Absolutely. The speed that you need to be able to react is critical, but also predicting when you might need to ramp down or when a battery might need to come up based on what the weather forecast might be, for example. So AI and its predictive capabilities are absolutely critical for not just industrial manufacturers to forecast when they're going to be running their production lines, but for everything in the grid to be turned on and turned down and for everything to work together.
And Gianfranco, I think you now see renewables as affordable in the supply mix. And if that's the case, what does that change in how renewables come into the grids?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. The renewable energy is becoming more and more affordable. And if you look at the demand of electricity, what are the forecasts for the next 10, 15 years? We are talking about 2x of growth, largely driven by the industrial sectors. But the energy that we need today is an energy that is clean, cost-effective, and decentralized. And having an affordable renewable energy source is helping on that direction. However, the benefit of renewable energy goes together with the operational challenges. Today, in order to manage the volatility of the renewable, you need a grid that is interconnected and is modern. Also, in order to manage the decentralization that the renewable source do bring into the energy system. And we discussed a lot about the new grid or the modern grid. It has to be flexible, it has to be digital, and it has to be powered by advanced management system and software. And AI will play definitely a big role on that. And what is becoming critical and vital is the grid. So the grid is becoming the backbone of the energy transition. So affordable renewable energies, a modern grid, energy transition can happen. And what's the change, probably the most critical change that we are seeing is the use of electricity. Lisa, you were mentioning it early on. So in the past and traditionally, you have a unidirectional kind of flow of the electricity from centralized power grid into the point of consumption. And where is the change today? The change is that we are moving into a system that is way more integrated, interconnected, and bidirectional. So what the affordability of the renewable energies is bringing is also the possibility more and more for the consumers and large industries to have their own site generation with a cost-effective price. But not only. With the modern grid that is powered by renewable and digital, the consumers are moving into prosumers. So the consumer is becoming part of the energy equation. And all this new system brings, in my view, two very important things. First one, electricity and the electrification is becoming, from a techno-commercial point of view, very compelling for the industry. And secondly, this is a system that it will be more and more interconnected between supply and demand. And what is important is the role of the stakeholders. And here there is a big change versus the past. So now you have more stakeholders around the table, and we have to make sure that the stakeholders are collaborating in a solid way in order to drive efficiency and higher output.
Capital and technology followed by behavior. So on capital and technology, what has to change in grid operation to enable it to achieve what you've described? And also, don't forget to double the electricity usage in 2050. It sounds like a huge challenge for us.
It's definitely a huge challenge, yes, but today, I mean, as you can see even today in the Innovation Hub down here, you can see how much technologies we have today in order to modernize the grid. Obviously, what we need is a system where we invest in renewable, but at the same time, we are investing into the grid, into the modernization of the grid, so bringing capital into the grid. And I think South Australia is quite a benchmark for the rest of the world. And you need investment in advanced management system. You need investment in automation for the grid. You need investment in AI. As Lisa was saying, speed, reactivity, so the grid has to really work in real time. And this is where the capital has today to go.
And probably what comes with that around the world is change in the policy structure and the flexibility of governments to be able to make those changes, isn't it? Because it's normally the most regulated piece of our energy infrastructure.
And that's why you need this collaboration between the regulator, technology providers, consumers, and operator. Is the beauty of the new grid and the new technologies is really that is fostering and boosting the energy transition. I mean, I have a global view. There are countries where the energy is not deregulated, where you don't have the possibility to enhance flexibility or demand response. And this is a real bottleneck of the energy transition. So if we, as I said earlier, the consumption of electricity is growing 2x in the next 10, 15 years, and you have to be ready now in order to make functionable, scalable. Otherwise, the system is not going to work. And you can't do that if each party is working in isolation.
It reminded me, Marianne Lagneau, who's the CEO of Enedis, the big French DNO, she said, for every €1, but for every $1 invested in generation, you need an equivalent dollar into the grids. And I suspect that we're not sensing that yet. We're spending a lot on generation, but we're not yet thinking about grid capacity and agility with enough speed. Maybe we are, and I think Australia often tends to lead the way globally in these things. But certainly in Europe, and I was last week in the US, the grids are the forgotten intermediary at some point.
Yeah, and there are gigawatts ready to go into the grid that are there waiting to be unlocked.
Yeah.
So really, there is a big role that operators and regulators are playing on that.
We definitely need more speed in transmission upgrades and interconnections. So that's a critical issue in Australia.
Speed in execution or speed in flexibility? Or?
Yeah, both. I think we've talked a number of times, or I have across the couple of days so far, with folks who have expressed, their frustration, I suppose, with the speed of getting transmission up. And I would like to add to Gianfranco's comments that the objective of our energy system in Australia is for consumers. That's the national energy objective, is for it to work for consumers. So we need to make sure that as we move forward over the next 5, 10, 20 years, that we keep that in mind, because that is who the grid should be working for.
Leads me neatly onto the demand side. And Chao, working for one of the largest retailers in Australia on the demand side, and I think where most individuals see the energy transition is in their homes and their businesses and their schools. What's changing on that side? I imagine everything is an answer, but talk us through where you see the major changes.
Yeah, so we've definitely seen a huge growth in what Gianfranco said about the prosumers. So consumers are not just consuming anymore, they are investing in behind-the-meter assets. They are becoming a lot more engaged in energy, a lot more literate in energy. So over the last decade, we've seen huge growth in rooftop solar. So last year we reached a milestone of 4 million installations across the country, representing 25 gigawatt of rooftop solar capacity, contributing 11% to the power generation of the grid. And with this, we see a real shift in the load shape throughout the day. So before we had off-peak in the middle of the night when people were not consuming energy. Now we're seeing in the middle of the day when there's abundance of solar, you see prices very low, and you see consumers are seeing actually the feed-in tariff that they're getting from selling the excess solar back into the grid decreasing. So that's why they're now looking at investing in batteries alongside solar to soak up the excess solar and feed that in kind of the evening peak. We're seeing a lot of interest in EVs to do just that, because EVs is a perfect combination with solar. It's a very flexible load. You can plug it in to charge, soak up that solar, and when vehicle to grid and bidirectional charging becomes, a mass market thing in the country, that will be the holy grail for the energy system, being able to use your vehicle to get around from one place to another, but also using that vehicle as a massive battery to soak up that excess solar and then feed that back into the grid when demand is high and when prices are high.
I'm listening as a fan as well as listening as a part of this transition, because it's amazing change, isn't it, from the old world of state-owned coal-fired power stations feeding unidirectionally. 25 gigawatt is a substantial series of assets, in this case, many, many. And I had the pleasure this morning of having breakfast with a few folks, including James Brown from SA Power Networks, and I think he was telling me that more than 50% of South Australia rooftops have solar, and in certain days in the summer, all the generation comes in that direction, in the direction of flow. What's changing in the role for you and your company, the role of retailers then in Australia? How does that change to meet this new world?
Yes, so I would say two key changes. So firstly, retailers being able to develop the capability to manage all of these distributed energy assets. They manage solar, the batteries, the EVs, by enrolling them all into a virtual power plant, to be able to optimize the flow of these electrons both to the consumer but back to the grid. So that's the first capability that is required to be built. But then the second, and probably more importantly, is to be able to turn these into consumer propositions that make sense, so that consumers are able to trust their retailers or an intermediary to manage all of their distributed assets. They've made these investments into their solar, into their battery, into their EV. If there's no trust, they will not hand it over to the retailer to manage. And if everybody's managing for themselves, then that creates a lot of wastage, as Lisa said. Like if you are able to put all of these distributed energy assets into a common platform, and you're able to optimize when the battery is being charged, when the EV is being charged, when it's discharging, that creates a lot of value, both for the energy system, and then it's up to the retailer to then be able to share that value back to the consumer. So developing propositions such as, like, right now we don't have vehicle to grid, so we're doing just smart energy tariffs for EV drivers to encourage that optimal time of charge. So we've got 2 energy tariffs at the moment. Our first one is a 5 hour of free electricity every day between 10 a.m. and 3 p.m. So that really helps EV drivers to plug in when they're not driving, soak up that excess energy, help the grid soak up that excess energy, and just encourages more renewable to be put into the system. Our second tariff is actually just guaranteeing 8 cents a kilowatt hour to EV drivers as long as they remain plugged in, and we will manage when their EVs charging to match the price signals from both the networks as well as the wholesale market.
A couple of things struck me there is the deep collaboration that we need between the consumer and the retailer and the DNO, or the distribution network, I guess, and probably the regulator as you manage that balance. So it's a quadripartite, maybe more, negotiation. But also I'm wondering about education of the consumer, isn't it? Because maybe most folks are used to just taking the electricity as they need it and grumbling about the price of it. But here they become a prosumer or a generator in that respect, or a trader in some ways. How are you working on that? Are you in an education mode or a...
We find that as soon as the consumer make the investment in an energy asset, they become a lot more engaged in energy. Like before, a lot of people wouldn't even know what their energy tariff was, like whether they're on a flat tariff or a time of news. They wouldn't know what a cents a kilowatt hour is. As soon as they invest in, say, solar, battery, if they have an EV, they now have multiple apps on their phone that looks at how much energy they're generating from their solar, when they should be charging their car, what they should be doing with their batteries, when they should be turning on their pool pumps. Like, they become very, very engaged in how the electrons are being used and how much money they can be saving or earning by doing all of that.
Well, I guess it's almost gamification of that. But it's vital, isn't it? Because the generation is moving from central generation almost to virtual power plants and solar.
Yeah.
And tell me about EV as a subject in Australia. I think you have 10% adoption.
10% of EV sales, yeah.
Which I would think is one of the highest in the world. Maybe China's higher, I think, but Europe, I think, is in the 1s and 2s. What needs to happen to keep driving EV?
Yeah, I would say Australia is still lagging the rest of the world in terms of EV adoption. 10% is what we would view as the tipping point in the industry when we look at the experience in Europe and China and other countries that have reached that 10% EV sales tipping point. That's when the mass market adoption occurs, and that's when that accelerated growth occurs. In Australia, we're hoping that 2025 will be that tipping point. We've got the new vehicle efficiency standard that kicked in 1 January that should bring in more affordable EV models and supply into Australia. We've got the fringe benefit tax exemption that will help on the demand side, helping Australians save over $10,000 per annum by salary packaging their vehicles. So we're hoping that this year we're going to see that accelerated growth. And then we need to see rollout of infrastructure across the country. The government has been, quite good in incentivising infrastructure, but there are still barriers, still pockets of barriers. So apartment buildings, upgrading those, retrofitting those to enable the residents to easily charge in their apartments. In inner city suburbs where there is no off-street parking, finding a solution for that. So that's the other enabler of EV adoption that we need to see.
I guess it's also a balance of government encouragement, subsidy, maybe to some extent penalising internal combustion, but also, I guess, is that range. And I suppose in Australia, you've just got such a big country as well, isn't it? I mean, I guess for folks that live in cities is one thing, but folks that want to travel between cities and towns is a challenge of charging as well?
We do have a big country, but if you look at the average travel distance of Australians, it's less than 40 kilometres a day.
Okay.
With a range of over 400 kilometres in a standard EV now. Australians don't, like, a range anxiety isn't really a thing, right? Like, you're not going to be driving from Sydney to Perth once a month, so that's not something that, like, you know, like, should be the barrier to EV adoption. And along the coast, along the highway, the network is being built out to accommodate those once a year, once every 6 months interstate travel.
Us five here, are we all EV car users?
I have a hybrid.
Hybrid?
I don't have a car, as well.
Oh, even
The
better.
most sustainable.
Even better.
How about you
very good on
folks?
bike.
EV? Good for you. Excellent.
Fantastic.
Thank you, Chow. Talked residential demand. Let's talk commercial industrial demand. But Byron, you're at the front end of this, helping industries to be more sustainable. How do we help industry move away from their addiction to hydrocarbons, both in terms of producing it, but more likely in terms of usage it in thermal processes?
Yeah, look, that's a really interesting question. Our customers are mostly in food and beverage. They're kind of stuck in the middle. They're not residential. They don't have the excitement, I guess, that you can generate with an app and seeing how much your solar is producing during the day. They're not steel makers or aluminium makers. They're not at that scale where they get a lot of government attention. It's sort of a hard target. They are distributed all through our cities and regional areas. One of the huge challenges for them is that they would use 3 to 4 times the amount of energy for thermal generation, for steam and hot water typically, than they would electrical energy, so in megawatt hours. And so when you look at how do we transition away from natural gas, LPG, typically the fossil fuels used in Australia for this steam generation, how do we get that into electricity, which I think is the most credible decarbonisation pathway? How do we do that in a way that we can, I guess, picking up on what Lisa said, connect the supply and the demand in a different way to how we connect it today? You know, we go back to, I guess, the original government-owned generators, and we had hot water services that would come on overnight to create this baseload demand that was synthetic to suit the style of the generators we had. We don't really have those incentives in place at the moment to suit the style of generation that we see coming into the grid. So if we look at wind and solar and how do we connect that, I know that Chow with the EVs, there's a lot of work there to try and connect that in real time, and we see exactly the same challenges at the factory. So how do we get 4 times more energy into these plants? How do we do it in a way that particularly doesn't overbuild the distribution system? And how do we get the distributors and the customers to work together in real time to, I guess, get benefits for everybody? And so in terms of, you know, specific examples, we're working with one of the DNSPs here in Australia at the moment on a special tariff arrangement for electrifying process heat on the basis that they have assets today at the zone substation and running down the street in terms of poles and wires that are sized for a peak load that they hit 1% of the time. And so all the tariff structures for fixed capacity are based around we have to make a return on that asset. It's regulated, but we're basically buying that 1% capability. And so what we're working with them on there is a real-time capacity signal for their assets that lets the customer have let's say, a concessional tariff that lets them buy the energy when it's in the market cheap, lets the DNSP not have to overbuild the infrastructure, and also allows them to connect more rooftop solar in these kind of zone substation areas. And so this is a really interesting kind of local way to do that. Mm-hmm. And then as we come out a bit further, there's a lot of talk about, well, why don't we just put rooftop solar on all the factories? That creates its own challenges. The scale of the problem is one. So that 3-4x energy, there's generally not enough rooftop space on these plants. They tend to be on the edges of cities. There's not a huge amount of excess land. The low capacity factor of solar at a site doesn't let you get the benefits of being on a connected distributed grid. And the upfront cost of having to buy that fuel all as capital on day one is a real challenge. There's the coordination, the collaboration that we see for these customers is really, from us on the vendor side, but the retailers, the DNSPs, and the power plants themselves all need to be working together to make sure that we can do this in a way that makes sense. If we're comparing typically for these customers $140, $150 a megawatt hour firm electricity to $20 a gigajoule gas, on its face that just doesn't work. And if we want to keep feeding our pets and eating chocolate bars and having fresh food, all these things require thermal energy at the processing and storage stage, and we have to do it in a way that really works effectively.
Are you finding it that they can drive it on a cost-effective way, or is it prohibitive and it has to be driven through sustainability? How does it look?
I think the trick here is to make sure that we achieve sustainability and decarbonisation in a way that doesn't put extra costs on one particular segment. So I think if you come in and say, we're going to put an internal carbon price on our thermal emissions, that's fantastic, but that doesn't help you against your competitors. It doesn't help you deliver value to your customers, your sort of direct value. So I think there's a real need to try and find ways that it works today. And so in some areas of Australia today, it works really well. If we look at particularly the manufacturing belts of Victoria, we can connect our customers today with a retailer that will give them wholesale electricity exposure and a DNSP that will give them some treatment on a tariff, and straight away we can compete with the fossil fuel price today. So we can manage their fuel price and their fuel supply risk, which particularly in Victoria is becoming a thematic, that it's actually hard to get the gas you've contracted for. I think there's a reversal of flow in the network from the south and Bass Strait. It's now having to come in through the north, and that adds extra cost. And so having that work today is really important, and having it work, certainly for us as a supplemental steam generator, we have to make it work out of fuel savings. So we have to find enough cost reduction in that electrification to pay for the asset just from the gas that it doesn't burn. And that is the challenge. There's opportunities there, but there's also some work to do.
Because it'll move better for sure if it's both affordable and it's sustainable together.
Yeah, look, absolutely. Affordability, I think, is the first thing it has to be. The sustainability, you can solve that on the journey. If you can make it affordable today, and you've got a 2030 or a 2035 sort of decarbonisation goal, you can work out how to green that electricity, how to come up with potentially new style PPAs that maybe have a bit more flex on dispatch. There's a lot of opportunities once you have the asset installed and you have the capacity to pull from the grid. And I think that's another sort of area, is how do we reinforce the distribution network, but only do it just enough to make this happen.
It's that collaboration theme, isn't it? Because I think part of the enabler is if we can find tariffs and interesting ways to make it bidirectional and to change the pricing models, right, then we're going to enable more change in the industrial sector. Do you see that the grids, because we're going to put more load on them again, I guess, if you're not using after the meter solar or wind, you're going to be having to expand grid capacity again. How do you see that?
I think that's the challenge, is how do we do that in a way that doesn't require overbuild. Look, I'm personally a fan of an incremental approach to that. If we go and try and do wholesale changes to the network, we're going to probably get it wrong. I think it's critical that all the stakeholders involved in transmission, distribution, regulation, generation, and on the customer side are working together to signal where they're going, what their timeframes are, how rule changes might help. Let's make the markets do the work, if you like, rather than kind of specific incentive schemes. So let's incentivise the behaviours we want, I guess, and tax the behaviours we don't.
You don't.
Yeah.
Gianfranco, you work in this space.
Yeah, absolutely. And what I'm seeing on top of what you're saying is what today we can do better is planning. So today the market, what we are seeing is still very reactive. So you have, a data center that decides to build a new data center in one area of the country. Then you have an industry that is maybe transforming their processes and increasing the load. And all of that is going to put a lot of pressure into the grid. And in my view, collaboration is also ability to anticipate what will be the future load. And if we have to move from a reactive approach to a more proactive, where the utilities, the operators are anticipating what could be the need of the industry, but by brand, not just the industry in general, but having a conversation that is way more fluid than what we have today. And this, to me, is critical to have in the future a grid and the possibility to really increase the load and the consumption of electricity.
Yeah, just on that, in the C&I space, I guess we see a lot of clustering. So we see similar industries located in the same small geographic area. And to what you said, Gianfranco, if one of them connects 4 MVA, fine, no problem. 2 of them, probably do that. But if 10 or 15 or 20 of them want to connect at that scale in the next 5 years, the DNSPs have no visibility into those plans. I think that's a problem with the structure of the way we interact with DNSPs today, and I think it's one of the real opportunities for collaboration is for the industry clusters to signal what they're looking to do in the next 5-10 years and potentially have that enable better investment decisions for the distributors.
Collaboration comes through each strand of this discussion, I think. Just as we wrap up, I know you'd like another hour, I'm sure, but we come to the end of our session here. I wanted to go along the panelists one by one and just ask them more on a behavioral human sense. What's your recommendation or your wish for the biggest thing we've got to change to make this work? Maybe, Chow, if I start with you.
Yeah, if I look at what is holding us back from going faster in this energy transition, yes, it's cost, it's the investments required, but actually inertia and the whole change management process is very important in making us not go as fast as we can. So, we've got corporate customers who have a 2030 target and they're like, well, we'll just do something closer to the time. But if you've got a fleet of 200 trucks that you need to decarbonize and electrify by 2030, you're not going to start in 2029 and think like you're going to achieve that. So overcoming the initial inertia and pick that low-hanging fruits and start on a small basis. Start with trials, start with pilots, and bring in other people. So bring in your energy retailer, bring in your technology provider, bring in the DNSPs, bring in people from other industries, because that's when you can get the most value by tapping into different pockets in the value chain. So we've got customers who do last mile delivery and they need to electrify. They don't have the space to install all of the charging stations. We've got customers who have car parks that are not used at night that can install charging stations for their customers during the daytime. And our last mile delivery customer can then tap into that infrastructure at night. So bringing in different industries to collaborate and tap into different pockets of value can really help make the transition a lot more affordable and less wasteful.
Yeah.
Fabulous. Lisa, thoughts?
In addition to that, I would add, I think that we have a trust issue holding us back. So in all of the things that we've discussed, the thing that jumps out to me the most is the need to share the value, but also share the risk. And by sharing the value and the risk that can be created, we can create more trust. And I think by building that trust, we'll be able to engage in these very meaningful and open conversations that need to be had in order for us to think about things like how could we use our assets differently. And I think industry organizations have a big role to play in that, and so does government.
Thank you. Byron?
Yeah, look, I'd like to pick up on the theme of sharing. For me, it's about sharing learnings. I think there's a lot of silos in the space that have been created through regulation and tradition. In order to do anything in the transition space in a timely fashion, if we don't learn from each other and and share that, we're not going to get there.
Thank you. Gianfranco, close us out here.
Yeah, I think I love what Lisa was saying in terms of trust. I think in a transformative journey, it's complex, and when there is complexity, we need to make sure that the knowledge is diffused. We need to make sure that the players are working together. And more than everything, we have to make sure that we have a common goal.
We have?
A common goal and mission. And that, to me, is very important.
I thought it was fascinating, but I hope you enjoyed it too. I summarize with the 4 key words here: optimization, trust, sharing, and common goals. And interesting that in a technology discussion, we're talking about human behavior, and maybe many of the big challenges in life come back to how we work together as much as how we develop together. If you could show your appreciation for your panel this morning. Thank you very much.